This is Marty with Marty's Diesel, and today's video is going to talk about what happens when somebody installs a Marty's Diesel fuel system and within a couple of months or a couple of 100 miles or even a couple thousand miles, the fuel pump fails. I'm going to talk about why we send out a vacuum gauge and why it's a great tool, but it also has its limitations. So you installed your fuel system and all of your numbers were good. Your vacuum numbers were within spec, your fuel pressure numbers were within spec, and everything was fine. You even recorded your fuel pressure numbers and your vacuum numbers for the first 100 miles per tank, like you're supposed to. So you take your vacuum gauge off and everything seems fine, and then 6 months later, 2,000 miles later, whatever it is, the pump stops working. Now, I don't care if this is a Walbro, one of the two Bosches, or the AEM pump, or whatever. But you go to install the vacuum gauge, and now your vacuum reads 0, your fuel pressure maybe reads 0, something along those lines, or maybe your fuel pressure reads 30 at all times, or it's all the way on the back side of the start needle on the fuel pressure gauge. We're going to talk about all the different conditions that cause that. Let's start by talking about what happens over time as the truck starts to develop a pre-pump issue and you don't know about it. Maybe you don't notice that your fuel pressure is the same, but your fuel pump is louder and your vacuum is higher. You can have pre-pump concerns that develop over time that were not evident when you did your install. And what happens is those umbrellas in your tank, maybe your selector valve gives you a problem, maybe the plastic or rust or whatever the case may be gets worse inside your tanks, and it will increase the vacuum, which increases the draw on the fuel pump, which will cause the fuel pump to eventually burn up. You must address that problem and probably simultaneously install a new fuel pump in order to have a good, reliable truck. It's not the fuel pump's problem if you have problems in your tank that cause the fuel pump to fail. As a reminder from our other video that I just recorded that talks about how we don't warranty the fuel pumps, this right here is one of the main reasons why. It's not the fuel pump's problem, or it's not the cause of the fuel pump that it fails if you have an inlet restriction that exceeds our specification. So likely you'll need to purchase another fuel pump and put it on, and then make sure you have your vacuum gauge and make sure you put it on as well. Always make sure that your vacuum gauge and your fuel pressure gauge read 0 when they're not installed. If they do not, you need to put a new gauge on. If you have an issue with your front tank, you need to drop the tank, you need to address the issue, you need to get it within spec. The same thing is to be said about the rear tank. This is near the bottom of our 17-step by step diag or 17-step installation instructions. You must follow these instructions. And if you ever put a new fuel pump on, you must start over at step 1. Keep in mind, on our website, underneath the fuel pump that you buy, we have a step-by-step video that shows you how to install it properly as well. If your vacuum is high, you have to do something about it. If you choose not to, your pump is not going to be reliable and your truck is inevitably going to break down. Now, this can happen over time. And if it happens over time, the course of action is to replace the fuel pump and remedy whatever is wrong inside your tanks. There really is no other way around it. Now, sometimes people say, well, my mechanical fuel pump never had these problems. Well, you're right. Your mechanical fuel pump didn't pull the same vacuum that this electric fuel pump that's on your truck pulls. So keep this in mind. Our fuel pumps, as whether they're the Walbro, the Bosches, the AEMs, or whatever, they legitimately suck more, even though that sounds bad, but they actually pull more fuel out of your tanks than what the factory mechanical pump did. So therefore, it's going to cause, or it's going to experience a failure because it's reliant on that fuel to come through your sending unit, to come through your selector valve, to come through all of your fuel lines and supply the fuel pump with fuel to not only lubricate it, but to also cool it down. If you are lacking lubrication and lacking cooling, that electric motor inside your fuel pump is going to burn up. And it might not happen right away. As the vacuum increases, that means the draw increases, that means the restriction increases, and eventually it kills the fuel pump. Let's talk about how selector valves can do something same or similar, and how it can cause your fuel pressure gauge in the valley to oversweep. Let's say you're driving down the road and you have debris start coming apart inside your tank. Slowly, it starts collecting in your sending unit. Eventually, it moves to your selector valve. Well, inside your selector valve, you have a feed and a return chamber that moves. What I've experienced is that the feed will sometimes get blocked because of the debris that's inside the tank that has now moved to inside the selector valve. And when you go to switch your tanks, it might switch the feed, but it might switch the return, but it won't switch the feed. Sometimes this is partial, sometimes this is complete. In extreme cases, one tank will overfill rapidly, and you might even have experienced this where like you're driving down the road and it seems like your fuel level gauge increases with time. Sometimes people think like, oh, well, this is just an old gauge or this is an old sending unit, maybe that's why. In my experience, the gauge actually reads accurately unless you have a particular like gauge code, but that's a whole another topic of discussion. But without a code, typically that gauge is reading properly. And it's actually increasing the fuel in that tank, and it's because of the selector valve. Now, when that happens, all you have to do is overfill one of your tanks and create a return restriction, which will then spike your fuel pressure. Now, it might not spike it immediately, it could also spike it over the course of 5, 10, 15 minutes. Whatever the case may be is that you will cause that fuel pump to see 90, 100, 120, 130, 140, 150 psi until the fuel pump fails. Typically, the fuel pump will then get weak. Typically, the fuel pump will still turn on, but it won't move fuel. Typically, you'll look at your fuel pressure gauge and it will never go back to zero again. We do not warranty this condition. We're not going to warranty the gauge. We're not going to warranty the pump. The recourse or the response that needs to be taken here is that you install a new fuel pump and you start over at step 1 of our 17 step-by-step diag or installation. I keep saying diag, but you can use it for diag as well. And you will need to install a new fuel pressure gauge up in the valley. And you'll need to figure out which tank or tanks or selector valve is giving you a problem. If you go to our pre-pump solutions page, it tells you how to blow those sending units out, and it tells you how to blow the selector valves out. And our pre-pump solution kit or any one of our single tank conversions or our selector valve delete kits all take care of that problem that I just mentioned. So realistically, if you have a fuel pump that fails after 1,000 miles, you are likely going to find a vacuum gauge that doesn't read much above zero during testing. You're going to find that the fuel pump doesn't sound right. You're going to find that the fuel pressure gauge doesn't read zero anymore. And when you see any one of these 3 things, more than likely you're going to need to buy a new fuel pump and restart your 17-step process all over again. And you should be familiar with it because you just did it when you installed the kit. This video should be a very good, broad, general way to view what happens when you have a fuel system that was recently installed and then in a short period of time failed. I will get into further detail on what you can do after that in another video, but today's video I just wanted to talk about what you do when you have a fuel system that fails shortly after you installed it. This has been Marty's Diesel. Hope you like my videos. I'm going to keep them coming. Thanks. Bye.